Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we'll follow James and Diep as they spend Tet together in a small bamboo house, wrapping Bánh Chưng side by side. What starts as a simple tradition quickly turns into something deeper, each fold and knot pulling up the feelings James keeps trying to outrun, and each quiet look from Diep asking him to stay, not just physically, but with his heart. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. James didn't realize what he was doing until the knot tightened. One loop, a pull, another cross, fast, clean, almost instinctive, like his hands knew how to make things look finished, even when his life wasn't. When he finally let go, the Bánh Chưng sat in front of him with a perfect bow centered on top, a gift-wrapped square of rice and leaves, too polished for something so humble. Diep stared at it, then she lifted her eyes to him soft, but unblinking. "You tied it like you're begging it to forgive you." James's jaw flexed. "It's just a string." "No," she said quietly. "It's you." The bamboo house held its breath around them, the morning light pale and thin through the slats. Outside, roosters argued like nothing in the world had ever broken. Diep looked down again, not to escape him, but to keep her voice steady. "You're here," she said, "but you're still running." James's fingers hovered over the bow, twitching once like he wanted to untie it, like he wanted to vanish. "I'm not running," he said, too fast. Diep didn't fight him. She just slid another leaf bundle closer, calm as if she was offering him a second chance he didn't deserve but desperately needed. "Then stay with your hands," she murmured, "not your exits." Earlier that morning, Tet had arrived quietly, almost shy. The bamboo roof still held last night's mist, and a faint thread of smoke drifted over the fence from a neighbor's kitchen. Inside, Diep moved with that steady rural confidence, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, laying everything out on a woven mat like setting the table for a promise. Sticky rice, pale as snow, thick green leaves stacked like folded vows, mung beans and marinated pork carrying the clean, familiar scent of home. James hovered near the doorway, half in and half out, like peace was something he could only borrow. Dark long sleeve shirt, sleeves pushed up, hands shoved into his pockets. His eyes followed Diep's movements with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like hunger. "You're staring," Diep said without looking up. "I'm observing," he replied, and something almost like humor flickered at the corner of his mouth. Diep glanced at him. "Observing doesn't wrap Bánh Chưng." He exhaled and crouched beside the mat. The bamboo floor creaked under him, and for a moment he looked strangely unsure, like he didn't know where his hands belonged if they weren't leaving. Diep pushed a small bundle toward him. "Today you learn," she said, "not to impress, not to prove, just learn." James touched the leaf. Cool, smooth, alive. It startled him how much weight tradition could carry without making a sound. Diep demonstrated first slow patience, leaf flat, rice spread, a hollow pressed in the center. Beans and pork were placed like a secret. More rice, fold, 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 corners tucked in with confidence, not force. James tried. The leaf slid, rice scattered. His square turned into a tired rectangle that looked like it wanted to escape. Diep laughed, bright, sudden, uncontrollable. The sound filled the bamboo house and hit him in the chest like sunlight. He froze, embarrassed, then looked at the mess in his hands and laughed too, rough and short, like a door creaking open after years of being locked. "So," he said, holding it up, "this is a modern interpretation." "It's a tragedy," Diep teased, then softened as she adjusted his leaf. "You're forcing it. Bánh Chưng doesn't like force." The words landed deeper than she meant. James's smile thinned. "Right. Diep didn't push. She only covered his hand with hers for a beat, warm, steady. "Slow," she said. "Let it sit in your hands first." He swallowed and tried again, slower this time, letting the leaf guide him, crooked but holding. Then he reached for the strings with sudden determination, and that was when his hands betrayed him into making the bow. Now Diep watched him, waiting. James stared at the gift like a knot, as if it had spoken first. "I didn't mean to," he muttered. "Maybe you did," Diep said, gentle but sharp. "Just not with your head." James's throat moved. His eyes didn't lift. "I'm here," he insisted. "Yes," Diep whispered. "Your body is." Outside, the day kept brightening, stubbornly ordinary. Diep placed another leaf in front of him, a quiet challenge. "Wrap one more," she said, "and this time, don't tie yourself into it." James nodded once, rigid. Then he set his hands on the leaf, like a man learning how to stay. He didn't rush this time. He flattened the leaf with both palms, feeling the cool, waxy surface settle under his touch. When he poured the sticky rice, he did it slowly, spreading it like he was smoothing out a crease in his own thoughts. Diep watched without interrupting, only tapping the corner once when his fold drifted. "Breathe," she whispered. "I am." "You're holding your breath," she corrected, and the smallest smile tugged at her mouth. James let out a quiet exhale, then folded again. The square came out crooked, but it held. The next one was better. By the fourth, his hands stopped trembling. The strings still fought him, but he didn't let them turn into a bow. He tied plain knots and honest knots. Diep didn't praise him like a teacher. She only glanced at the growing line of green wrapped bundles and said softly, "See, you can stay with something long enough to finish it." The words made James look up, and for a second his eyes were too open, like he'd been caught wanting. By late afternoon, the bamboo house smelled like leaves and rice and something older than both of them: ritual. Diep carried the cakes outside in 2 careful trips, setting them beside a wide pot perched on a red stove. The metal looked seasoned, dependable, like it had witnessed more Tet nights than any person could count. James followed, sleeves rolled up, shoulders squared, as if this was a job. He stacked the Bánh Chưng in the pot with surprising tenderness, fitting them together like blocks that mattered. Diep poured water until the bundles disappeared beneath the surface. "This is the part where you can't run," she said, half teasing. James glanced at her. "Good." They lit the fire. The first flame caught with a soft snap, then grew hungry and steady. Smoke curled upward through the trees. Somewhere nearby, someone's radio played a faint, festive tune that drifted in and out with the wind. Diep sat on a low stool beside the stove, knees tucked close, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. James didn't sit right away. He crouched, checked the flame, adjusted the wood, then checked it again, like if he looked away, the world would change its mind and punish him for relaxing. "You're being dramatic," Diep said gently. "I'm being careful." "You're treating the fire like your enemy." James's mouth tightened. "I've had worse enemies." The air cooled as evening slid into night. The bamboo and trees turned into dark shapes, and the fire became the brightest thing in their world, orange light painting Diep's cheeks, sharpening the edges of James's face. For a moment, Diep watched him stare into the flames like he was searching for a way out hidden inside them. "Do you ever miss being happy?" Diep asked, so quietly it almost sounded like she was talking to herself. James blinked, thrown. "What?" Diep kept her eyes on the pot. "Before everything, before you learned to disappear." James's throat worked, the fire cracked, and the pot began its slow, patient simmer. He stayed crouched, but his voice came lower. "I didn't learn to disappear," he said. "I learned to move." "Same thing," Diep murmured. He shook his head, frustration flashing then fading, replaced by something tired. "When I was still, in that world," he said, choosing each word like it could cut him. "Standing still was dangerous. If I stayed still, someone would find me. Someone would use me, control me, hurt people around me." Diep's fingers tightened around her cup. "So you ran." James stared at the fire until his eyes shone. "I told myself it was a strategy," he admitted. "But it became a habit, a reflex." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of nights Diep had waited, of mornings James had left without looking back, of the fear that love might never be stronger than survival. Diep lifted her gaze. "That bow," she said suddenly. James flinched. "What bow?" "The one you tied," she said, "on the first cake." He looked away, ashamed in a way he couldn't explain. "It was stupid." "It wasn't," Diep replied. "It was honest. You tied it like you wanted to make something look safe." James's voice cracked just once. "It is a gift." Diep's tone softened into something almost fragile. "To who?" James looked at her, then really looked. "To the part of me that keeps leaving," he said, to convince him to stop. The fire popped. The pot kept simmering. Diep reached out and rested her hand over his, not gripping, not pleading, just anchoring. James didn't pull away. He didn't stand up. He didn't search the dark for an exit. He stayed. And when the first pale hint of morning crept through the trees, they lifted the cakes out, steaming and heavy. Diep cut one open, and the green leaf peeled back to reveal the tight, perfect layers inside. James took a bite, then another, like he was proving something to himself without saying a word. Diep watched his face, the way his shoulders loosened, the way his eyes finally stopped scanning. "It tastes right," James murmured. Diep smiled small, sleepy, real. "Because you didn't force it." James looked down at his hands, then back at her, and for the first time all night, his voice sounded like it belonged to someone who could build a life instead of escaping one. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "One fold, one fire, one night at a time."
Diệp đón tiếp với Diệp tại căn nhà tre của bà, học cách gói bánh chưng như một cách để rèn luyện sự hiện diện. Lần đầu tiên chiếc bánh của anh trông như một chiếc nơ quà tặng, cho thấy anh đang cố gắng gói sự bình yên trong khi vẫn muốn chạy trốn. Diệp nhẹ nhàng khuyến khích anh, hướng dẫn đôi tay của anh và thúc giục anh chậm lại để hoàn thành những gì mình đang làm. Khi họ sắp xếp bánh vào nồi vào giữa nửa lúc suốt đêm, truyền thống này đã trở thành tấm gương phản chiếu nỗi sợ hãi của James. Dưới ánh lửa, anh thừa nhận mình đã học cách tiếp tục tiến về phía trước và đứng lên, khiến anh cảm thấy nguy hiểm. Diệp không van xin, bà giữ anh lại bằng sự kiên nhẫn đến bình minh. Chiếc bánh chưng đã hoàn hảo và James quyết định ở lại một đêm.